So just a couple of housekeeping things here as we get started. First, welcome again to the water mitigation track of Connect Pulse, our kickoff session here for the week. For those that are logging in, we've got about 9 minutes until we get started. In the interim, if you've got anything you want to talk about here with Clark and I as we host the session here today, feel free to drop that into the chat. But a couple things on the housekeeping side, we are going to close the chat down once we get started, and instead of using chat during the session, we'll actually use the Q&A section of Zoom. So if you're not familiar with the Q&A section, you might want to take a peek at it. That Q&A session is down where you access the chat and the other tools there in Zoom. But we'll actually take any questions as a Q&A input. We may stop during the session to answer questions if it's you know, the right time right there in the presentation. We may also hold them off a bit till the end. We'll do our best to get to every question that we can. So with that, again, Brandon Burton here with you with Clark Hawkins, and we'll begin here at the top of the hour. And as we do that, I'm going to go ahead and get my chat window open here and working. And Clark, can you see any chats coming in here on the chat window?
Not yet, Brandon.
All right, perfect. So a couple things here we'll get kind of started off with, just to kind of warm up. And again, feel free to drop anything you'd like to into the chat if you've got anything you want to talk about here before we get started. But a couple things we can talk about. There's lots going on in the industry these days. I've got new standards coming out from the IICRC S500 just recently updated. Get a lot of questions about whether or not you know, changes in standards are something that is going to come further on here in the next year. We've got a fire standard coming out in the standards. The water standard just released its 2021 edition. There's actually even one coming out on wildfires, so a lot's happening on the standards front. Clark, any thoughts, any conversation on the standards side with kind of the applications and tools from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time. You know, obviously we have rounds of modifications and adjustments to the standards regularly, but I think it's one of the fun parts of my job is to keep up with them and think of compelling ways to kind of keep our applications up to date, you know, with the shifting standards and come up with innovative ways to provide, you know, our users with interesting ways to go about you know, documenting, whether it's documenting the jobs, new documentation standards, things like that. You know, it's an exciting time whenever we get the new standards coming around.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's really amazing to me about this industry is I've often said it's been about 20 years on the training side of this industry, and it's amazing to me how much there is to stay up to date on in this market. Not only do you have to be an expert in all of these technical subjects as it relates to how to drive buildings and building construction and things like this, but what you have to understand about the insurance community, about just customer relations and customer management and kind of working with the emotional duress of a loss that happens in a home or a business. Staying current on all of these different subjects is a challenge. That's one of the things that really excites me about the digital space, is it helps so much with that, staying current with these things as they change and as they move, not the least of which becoming even more complicated here in the last couple of years with everything we've dealt with the pandemic and COVID. So it really is the right time and space in this industry to be in touch with those tools that help you stay on top of all that technical information.
Absolutely. Well said. It can't be overemphasized, with how fast technology changes, and then on top of that, keeping our industry standards, in mind when we're developing new product enhancements and things like that. It is, in a way, you're always chasing the tail. It's a fun game to play, though. It's an exciting thing, so it's great. It is a mad dash, I guess you could say.
I'm going to pop open our attendee list here and see who all we've got joining so far. Looks like we've got about 49 folks on so far. We're expecting, I think, to break about 100 to 150 today for this session, somewhere in that neighborhood. I'm seeing quite a few folks, actually, some that I recognize here already in the attendee list from some past training events. And again, don't hesitate if you've got something that you'd like to chat about here. We've got about another 5 minutes before we officially get started. So if there's anything you'd like to chat about here this morning before we roll into the actual presentation, don't hesitate to drop that in the chat. And again, just a reminder for everybody on how we'll run this kind of administratively. The chat will be open as we kind of warm up here this morning. But as soon as we actually launch the presentation, we're going to close down the chat, and instead we're going to use the Q&A tool, the question and answer tool. So again, if that's something new to you, I think most of us have probably spent a lot of time on Zoom over the last couple of years here. But if Zoom is relatively new to you, you might want to find that Q&A tool in your menu on Zoom and make sure you've got that open. And as we're going through the presentation, don't hesitate at any moment to drop a question into the Q&A. Clark and I, as we co-present today, we will drop answers into the Q&A, and we may actually answer them live during the session. Some questions we may hold till the end, depending on what the question is on. So did see something come in here in the Q&A that we'll hit right now from Travis. Thank you, Travis. I'd like to learn about building SOPs for job safety, namely water mitigation. Are there any resources that I can look at? A couple things with as it relates to safety and standard operating procedures for safety specifically. I'll talk from a standards perspective. There definitely are some safety related guidelines that we can find in something like the S500. Obviously, if you're in the United States, there's a lot we can find through federal resources, but there is a project underway right now with the IICRC that I'm super excited about, the Safety and Health Field Guide for Restorers. If you haven't heard anything about that, it's going to actually go into a public review period here in the next month. And it's really a wealth of information about everything health and safety as it relates to water mitigation. So Travis, I definitely look for that. Like I said, it'll be in public review here in about a month. If you're not familiar with it, go to iicrc.org, go to standards, and you'll see the Safety and Health Field Guide as a project right there. And you can actually click on that and sign up to go into the public review on it. So you'll have access to it super early. So that'd be one resource that I would look to that I'm definitely excited about coming out here recently. Clark, anything you want to add?
No, I think that covered it, Brandon.
All right, perfect. So again, Travis, thanks for breaking the ice on the Q&A tool for us there. Again, if you haven't found that Q&A tool, now is the perfect time to look because we're going to get started here in about 60 seconds. So also the chat tool is going to close here in just a moment. So with that, I'm going to close my chat window and give it one more scroll on attendees. Looks like we're up to about 64. All right, and again, noticing lots of familiar names here in the attendee list. Wonderful to see those of you that I've been in sessions with before. Welcome back, and welcome to our kickoff Connect Pulse event. All right. Hello, Jay. Nice to see you, my friend. All right, perfect. All right, any closing thoughts, Clark, before we roll into live session?
Just another question here. This webinar will be recorded and shared with attendees.
Absolutely. All right, and with that, Beth is going to move us over into presentation mode, and we're going to get started. So with that, let's go ahead and start off with some introductions here. My name is Brandon Burton. I am the Vice President of Technical Application with NextGear Solutions, a CoreLogic company. I am also the IICRC ANSI Standards Chair, which basically means that I reside over the groups and individuals that publish all of the IICRC standards in cleaning, restoration, inspection, et cetera. I'm going to talk today predominantly about water mitigation from a standards perspective, talk about the new and recent update with the S500 and some of the things that I think are critical in implementation in those changes to your business. And with me today in the presentation is Clark, and I'll let Clark introduce himself. So Clark, your floor.
Thanks, Brandon. Hi, everybody. My name is Clark Hawkins, and I am in the product team with CoreLogic and NextGear Solutions, mainly overseeing our water mitigation products. Mika originally came from Moisture Mapper, and prior to that was a restoration technician and project manager for a time. So really excited to get to speak with you all today. I'm going to be covering kind of how the changes in the S500 standards kind of correlate back to digital documentation for your water mitigation projects.
All right, perfect. And thank you for joining us today with the presentation, Clark. Clark brings a great set of expertise. He's been in the software space in and around water mitigation for some time, and actually was born in the trenches of the water damage industry. So it's been great working with Clark on this project.
Thanks, Brandon.
So with that, here's kind of an overview of where we're going to go. So again, as I go through, I'm really going to focus on the S500 and hit on what I think are some of the most pertinent changes in that S500 2021 edition. That's going to take us through just kind of a general overview. First of all, I'll give you a really high level summary of just the metrics on the changes. And then we're going to get into detail on things like inspection and monitoring, equipment and tools, and safety and health, actually, one of the questions that came up here as we got started. So with that, first, let's just take a look at a high level kind of summary of what changed. Hopefully at this point, everybody's had a chance to get a copy of this new document. You've begun kind of reading through the document. I know it's a hard read cover to cover, but hopefully you've at least gone through some of the most pertinent sections of the document. Overall, here's kind of my summary for you of what changed. In the definition section up front in the document, where we find all of the key terms that we use in this industry, especially those that are specific to water damage mitigation, like category and class and things like that, we had 15 additional terms added, and 3 of the existing terms were updated. One of those updates was to the definition of category 3, which is a really important update that we'll touch on. In addition to the changes in definitions, the reference guide was also removed from the document. So those that are familiar with the S500, it previously was the S500 standard and reference guide. That is now just the S500 standard. All right, so the reference guide was removed. And that really is what drove a lot of the changes in the document, because there was a lot of important content that was in the reference guide that got moved over into the standard in order to kind of stand up that language. And that made a couple of very key changes in the document. A lot of the changes that we see from a standard of care perspective, at least, were born from that change. One example I'll get into later is with air filtration devices, air scrubbers, air filters. There was language on the use of air filtration devices in the reference guide previously that was very important language. It got elevated to the standard because the reference guide was being removed. And in essence, what that did is it really elevated the authority of that language. And we'll talk a little bit about that and what that means. Another change that happened with the S500 is a couple of additional appendix documents were created, kind of for the same purpose. There were a couple of sections in the reference guide that again contained some important information that the consensus body who made these changes determined was important not to lose. One was a long list of materials and assemblies, and basically a description of those materials and assemblies, proper restoration procedures, cleaning procedures, drying procedures, etc. A very, very useful resource that was in the previous reference guide. And again, if we had just removed the reference guide and didn't retain that, a lot of value would have been lost. And then dehumidifier sizing. It's always been in the reference guide. It's never been in the standard, the dehumidifier sizing guidelines. And again, important information. A lot of the industry uses those sizing guidelines. So therefore, they were retained as an appendix document in the end. And then last but not least, the other really big substantive change that we're not going to talk a lot about today because of how the change was made, but section 12 on specialized experts was removed from the document. Although the language wasn't. The language that was in section 12 was basically relocated into the appropriate sections throughout the document. So for example, where a specialized expert may have been necessary to perform an assessment after a category 3 water damage from flood water or something like that, that language is no longer in section 12 because it doesn't exist. It's now in the structural restoration section where we talk about how to remediate category 3 water. Right, so it just relocated to the appropriate section so it could be read kind of in step with the information within the standard. All right, so that's kind of an overview, high level. Now let's start kind of digging into some of the details and get into the weeds. I'm going to start off with inspections and monitoring and talk about, to me, one of the more substantive changes that happened with the document, and it relates to the required documentation. So there's a section here, and I'm going to give you a list of a few sections that I would highly recommend that you do read word for word. In fact, there's sections that you want to earmark in the document. If you got a paper copy, put a little flag in there. If you're using a digital copy, just remember this is where this information lives. Section 924, required documentation. And this is basically a checklist for your flood file, right? Whether you're using digital documentation tools, paper documentation tools, whatever your method looks like, that method should include something that fills every one of these boxes. All right, contract and authorization, obviously, source and date, drying process, validation, et cetera, et cetera. The real big change here in the required documentation piece is that some of these items previously were in recommended documentation. And through the revision and through the change, a few of these items got elevated into required documentation, which means it is standard of care to ensure that you have this. And one of those in particular that really got clarified was drying process validation and verification and a certificate of completion. Those are two of the items that have been discussed in the previous standard, but they had not been elevated to standard of care. So again, just use this as a way to really check against the documentation you have in your business that you're using to document water mitigation, and just ensure these boxes are checked in your process. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Clark. Clark will talk a little bit about this from the digital side. Clark.
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, so as Brandon mentioned, as we start to think about how we keep applications updated with with an eye towards the changes that are taking place within the industry standards. I think a big one is the removal of the references section of the S500, and retaining some of that language. A part of benefits of a digital application for documentation is that we can keep those and our kind of subject of water mitigation right on target with everything that's going on with those changes. As we think about what tools do I need to take with me to the job site to make sure that I'm following these industry standards, to make sure that my technicians are up to date on all of the standard practices. We can keep these things right in our pocket, in our phone. So as with some of these changes, I wanted to highlight some of the things that our required documentation provides us within an application such as MICA, that allows you to sign forms electronically in the field. So your work authorizations, your certificates of completion, you can keep a catalog of these that are always with you. So, giving you the ability to have a homeowner sign those forms, especially in the time of COVID, you don't even have to pass the phone over to them or the tablet over to them to have them sign it. You can email it to them from there. They can sign it electronically, send it back to you, and it's automatically in your documentation. And then of course, all of the key project events that take place that you need to, catalog what time that event happens. It allows you to do that as well. So just having a digital platform, gives you those tools that allow you to have the bare minimum of what your documentation should require. But it also gives you the added, technical data around, substantiating your equipment application, so saying based on the dimensions of this loss, the extent of the water damage, I would recommend installing this amount of equipment. It kind of allows you to validate what you're doing on the job site, no matter how complex the loss is. And of course, through documenting that equipment usage, enabling you to verify, here's why I installed this amount of equipment, not just because it felt like the right amount, but because I have validation from an algorithm that's derived from the industry standards. So, capturing all of this data through a digital documentation platform just gives you the tools to tell the story of the loss, right? So keeping that project narrative going, right? So that you have clear communication with all the parties involved that really backs up your process.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Clark.
Yes,
and as we go through this and we talk about some of these implementations, it's important the digital side of documentation brings a lot of merit to the water mitigation space. But just a couple of things that I want to just kind of share out as we talk about the digital space. It's important that a digital tool, as your organization looks at those digital solutions, make sure it is a digital tool that works for your organization. And on this topic specifically, one of the things that's really important about the digital piece is that your forms and your ability to capture that information in those forms in a way that makes sense for your workflow and the needs that your business has from a legal standpoint, from a liability standpoint, and just from a functional standpoint. You really want to be able to ensure that you've got an ability to build those forms the way that they work for your business. It's just something I really encourage you to look at when you look at, if you're not already in the digital space, if you're looking to become in the digital space, just look for that as something that is going to be intuitive, something that is going to be a part of that system, because you not only so that you can ensure that things like a work authorization and things like that work well for your business, but because many of you have also a very diverse line of business services and the type of services that you're providing even within water mitigation. So I just give you that as kind of a note and a tip. The next area I want to transition to here is related to the required documentation, but it's in and around drying goals and dry standards. And I kind of want to set this topic up this way. For a long time in this industry, we have had dry standards, we have had drying goals, to the extent that many in the industry have begun to think of the two terms as being synonyms or meaning the same thing, which is an unfortunate mistake, because drying goals and dry standards are two entirely different things. One of the things that this particular consensus body and revision of the standard set out to do was to really clarify the difference between these two terms, because they technically serve two different purposes. They're really for two different things. Now, and to kind of give the background into that, a dry standard is, it's a benchmark, right? It is it's a chalk line that you snap at that point in time, in that region, at that time of year, in that particular property with its environmental control systems to find out how those materials are responding at that exact moment in an unaffected state. And it's an input, right? If I'm establishing a drying goal, right? Where am I going to finish this drying process and be confident that I'm leaving behind an amount of moisture that's not going to cause additional damages, it's not going to aesthetically impact or functionally impact the material in any way, that moisture that I'm leaving behind, then I want to understand what the unaffected materials look like, but that's not going to be the drying goal that I set necessarily. It may be, right? As a professional, I'll make that determination and I'll make that judgment, but the dry standard in and of itself is not the only input into that process. There are several inputs into that process. And that is really how the language changed. Is a language change to really separate these two, so that we do have dry standards. They're an important part of the process. They're important input into the process, but a drying goal is not a dry standard. In fact, all of the ranges between dry standard and drying goal were removed from the standard. Right, and I'm going to say that one more time because that's really, really important. The range between dry standard and drying goal was removed from the standard. So you don't have the language in there anymore that says that your drying goal should be within 10% of your dry standard, period. Right, because unfortunately that's an oversimplification of the way that we use dry standards. Right, if I'm drying, for example, in Colorado in the middle of the winter, and I get a dry standard on a 2x4 framing material that's 7.5, but I know in that region that I can see 9, 10, 11, and 12 quite normally in that region at different times of the year, and that's going to cause no ill effect to the framing materials, then why would I dry the framing materials all the way down to 7.5, right? I'm drying out moisture that really does not need to be drawn out of that building material. So to make that distinction and make that clarity, again, these two are separated. The only two standard of care items as it relates to a drying goal that we must do, or that we should do, which basically means must in the standard, is that we need to ensure that the drying goal returns structures, systems, and contents to an acceptable condition, and that it will not allow for or it will inhibit microbial growth. Those are the two things that we need to attain. Right, from a function standpoint, an aesthetic standpoint, the moisture is not going to cause any change, and from a microbial standpoint, it's going to be at a level that won't support microbial growth. And as long as your dry standard does those, or your drying goal rather, does those two things, then you are in compliance with the standard. Your dry standard is just one of the inputs into that process. So Big change in the S500 from a philosophical standpoint on the way these work. And again, here, as I get out of drying goals and dry standard from a standard standpoint, I'm going to hand things back over to Clark, talk a little bit about the digital space as it relates to dry standards and drying goals.
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, and I think that's a significant change. This idea that we're eliminating a specific range of that distinction between a drying goal and a drying standard, right? With digital documentation, you were giving yourself a bit of a backbone on which to stand. From the perspective of having those standards, your dry standard and your drying goal actually as distinct entities in your documentation. So you're setting a clear, as Brandon alluded to, you're setting a clear benchmark for what your goal actually is when you go to set about drying a structural material. With your digital platform, you're organizing your project in a way that allows you to go back and see, okay, on day one, we inspected this material and it was at this certain moisture content. We've established our dry standard and we've set our dry goal. And so you can come back and have this repeatable process for documenting everything that's going on the job at a specific property. By creating these inspection points in Mika and documenting when you're actually collecting these readings and validating precisely what your measurements were on each day of a drying project. And it's going to allow you to see whether or not you're making progress. When I take a high-level view of my project in a digital documentation platform, I can see how far I have to go before I've reached that material's dry standard or approximate dry standard in our drying goal. So just being able to monitor that progress in a digital platform, not only for your operational standpoint of seeing what's going on day to day on a project, but also being able to report out on that. So at the close of the job, you can see that I've maintained this level of progress to see whether or not the building is trending towards dry or whether you're meeting some challenges. And it allows, by identifying those challenges, you can communicate those challenges and kind of stay ahead of the game so you're not playing catch up throughout the drying process.
Thank you, Clark. Again, here on this discussion from a digital perspective, I just want to throw in a tip. The hardest thing about monitoring in any organization, in my opinion, is ensuring that monitoring process is consistent, right? A lot of the technicians and project managers in each organization, they're very good at inspecting a property. Most organizations are not very good at monitoring a property. And those are two very, very different skill sets, right? An inspection is something where you go into a property and you look in a very, very high number of locations to try to track your water migration and assess kind of the components that build up an assembly and how far the water's penetrated. That requires a lot of different meters, a lot of different settings, a lot of different probing, if you will, to figure out exactly where that water rests. The problem with a lot of organizations' kind of standard operating procedure, though, is that typically what happens is that the technician on day two, when they come out to monitor the job, they come out with an inspection mindset, right? And they again re-inspect the property, and they may use a different meter on a different setting and a different location and a different kind of setup on the probes, whatever it is. And then they get their number and they get a good feel for how wet the building is on day two. The problem is that's not very quantitative. It's kind of a qualitative process because now I can't compare to day one. I don't understand if we're making progress. And it's just kind of a soapbox for me personally, is that it's so critical to just really nail down the process. So as Clark was talking through these inspection points, this is a really critical step in your standard operating procedure. Whatever your method for doing it, you need to nail down, where are we checking for moisture on day two? What was the meter? What was the setting? What is the lens that I'm going to use to look at this value through? So I ensure that we're making progress, because I don't really care that you're still wet on day two, right? We're really good at knowing you're still wet on day two, but that's not what's important to me. What's important to me is, are we drier on day two than you were on day one? Right? Because if you are, it's working. If you're not, it isn't. And if it isn't working, you better change it, right? So it's really important to ensure that you're nailing down that process. And one of the things I like about the digital space is it's doing a better and better job of helping us kind of nail down that process and ensure that we're being consistent. So really important part of that solution. All right, so now kind of transitioning out of inspections and monitoring, I want to get into the equipment and tools side of the house here for a little bit. One of the things that I felt was a pretty substantive change in the standard as it published here in 2021 is that owner's manuals for our tools and equipment is actually now part of the standard of care. Right. Previous editions of the S500 would talk a lot about, what you should do with certain pieces of equipment and operation and things like that. This revision kind of took a step back from that, did the same thing with antimicrobials actually, but took a step back from that and said, you are going to follow your owner's manuals, basically follow your equipment manufacturer's recommendations for, the operation of, the installation of, et cetera, these different pieces of tools and equipment that we own and operate. So with that, that would cover operation, maintenance, safety, et cetera, whether you're talking about extraction equipment, air movement, dehumidification, or even the use of a meter, right? And the proper use of that instrument. All of that has been deferred to the manufacturer's literature. From an equipment standpoint and operation, I want to again pass it back over to Clark and talk a little bit about the digital space with equipment.
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, it's such an important part of any industry. Really, is you need to know what tools you're using to accomplish your job, and part of your toolkit is your drying equipment, your air movers and your dehumidifiers. And you develop an intimate knowledge of how these tools work out in the field. But there are some people who may have no idea. I may say, I'm installing an air mover at your house. Oh, you mean a fan? So despite the reasons for this being added to the S500 as a standard of care, it's kind of a no-brainer that you want to provide that supporting documentation for the equipment that you're installing in a property. And with a digital platform, it's 2021. We have PDFs that we can provide our owners' manuals for all of the equipment that we use, anything that's in our trucks. So as a part of our documentation process, we can easily just upload these documents into our digital platform so that you can easily access them to shore up, here's what I am documenting. Here's what we're installing in your property. Here's where you can review these user manuals that, allow you to just shore up your documentation. So maintaining your records of equipment. And to that end, other documentation as well, other manuals, operational manuals, documents that you develop yourself about your standard operating procedures that you can upload into a digital platform to kind of show that here's the process that we go by. This is our standard operating procedure, and it's well documented, and it's available digitally, right?
Perfect. Thank you, Clark. Yeah, and that's, again, just another great side of the digital space. The digital can create a lot of noise, right, if it's not used properly or implemented properly. But used properly, it can really help with ensuring that those standard operating procedures are something that is as easily accessible as possible in the field. In fact, many of the digital solutions will not only contain them in something like a document like we're using as an example here, but actually literally build it into a workflow, right? So as I move into a particular step, I have a task that's created inside of that mobile application so that the technician in the field says, here's the next step and here's what you've got to do. If I've got this item, I'm doing this task, this is the required step inside of that task. Quick reminder, by the way, is that I did have a question pop up in the Q&A here as we were going through this, and I just wanted to make just a note, that we're using Mika here as an example of the digital solution as we're going through the presentation today. There are many of you that are on, other digital tools that are out there. Some of them other tools that are available from next year. So I just wanted to make a note that we're using this as an example. There are great solutions out there in that space. And those of you that are, for example, using something like Dash Mobile, there are great solutions there as well. I don't want to represent that the only place you're going to get these features is going to be Mika. Some of them that would be true, but many of these features you're going to find as something would be an example, Dash Mobile or something like that. So, all right. So with that, let's go ahead and roll forward. The next space here that I wanted to touch on, now that we've gone through the equipment and tools on the owner's manual side, is I want to talk about the calculation side. I get a lot of questions about the dehumidifier calculations and whether or not they changed. The good news is that in this update of the S500, there's really not a lot new to learn here, because the dehumidifier calculations that were recommended in the previous reference guide are now the same dehumidifier calculations that are in the appendix document. The only real clarification that was made on the dehumidification calculation is that we need to ensure that we're considering, a number of different inputs when we do the calculation. That's the one thing that's really a trigger for standard of care. So we need to consider things like the types of materials, the class of water, what weather is going to do to you, what kind of power you have available, et cetera, et cetera. These all need to build into your calculation. And then the document provides in the appendix an example of what the calculation can look like. And there are two calculation examples provided. One is the detailed calculation that has a factor for many of these components. The other is the simple calculation. If we're not as concerned about the inputs of outdoor weather and things like that, then we can use the more simplified, simple calculation. But again, I want to stress the standard of care is to consider all of these elements. The actual calculation provided in the appendix is an example. It's a good example. It's got a lot of merit to it. There's been a lot of rubber on those tires that have been put on the road. It's been tried and tested by a lot of contractors out there. So I think it's a very good calculation. But if there is a reason why you want to use something else for the calculation, the standard of care provides for that. There are examples only. So with that stated, again, I'll pass things over to Clark. We'll talk about the digital space.
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, with digital platforms, you're especially like our tool Mika, baked into these platforms is a calculation based on the S500. So, when you go to get your certification and you're having to memorize all these, the charts of, how much dehumidification, what's my multiplier, what's the factor for this category and class of loss, things like that. You're kind of like, oh, how am I going to ever remember this? I'm going to need something to write this on or something. But with the digital platform, it's already in there for you. It takes away the guesswork of how much equipment do I add to this job? How much dehumidification do I add to this job? Or do I apply on this project? And you can flip between simple and detailed calculation depending on the given factors of your drying environment, right? Whether there's a tight building envelope or loose, or et cetera. So you're able to document every component of your thought process of how much equipment I need to successfully dry the structure to return to pre-loss conditions. So a digital platform is giving your technicians that repeatable platform so that it's eliminating the guesswork. And if there is any guesswork or questions, they can document, well, this is my working theory on the conditions of this loss. And so I'm making here's my hypothesis of how best to dry this structure. It's supported by my digital application. But if it doesn't work, I can provide notes on potential complications that arose, and kind of manage my equipment on that project. There was a question in the chat regarding our specific to our application Mika. I'll address that offline, but we are working on that.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Clark. Sure. Now the next area in equipment and tools I want to dive into is kind of a big one. It's a very direct change in the S500 that I think as an industry we need to be aware of, and it relates to air filtration devices. Air filtration, I'm going to kind of intro this way. Air filtration devices, also known as HEPA air scrubbers, negative air machines, et cetera, lots of different terminology, really depending on how you use them. But generically speaking, air filtration devices have been a part of the water mitigation industry for quite some time. And obviously, when we're dealing with water mitigation, that also involves known contaminants, whether it be because it's a category 3 or there's mold present or things like that, they become much more common. With the advent of some of the processes into our businesses that that many of us adopted when we entered the pandemic, the air filtration devices took yet another jump kind of northward in their frequency of use. There are lots of benefits to the use of air filtration devices. It's one of those things, however, that when you use an air filtration device, just kind of my lesson learned in the industry over the last 10 or 15 years on this topic, it's really important to take a step back and just ensure that we understand the reason that the air filtration device is being used, because it is one of those things that can very easily come to question the use of an air filtration device. So the language change in the S500 was really done to support kind of that mode, to have a logical path to the use of the air filtration device. And kind of let me dive into the language here to help understand what I mean by that. So where, I've got it right here on the slide, so I'm going to read this out to you. Where cleaning cannot sufficiently remove soil or particulates when airflow is directed through interstitial spaces, or there are high-risk occupants, it is recommended restorers install one or more air filtration devices. It's really important to break down that sentence, right, and digest that sentence one piece at a time. Basically, what this is this is a kind of an if statement, right? And for those of you that are comfortable working in Excel, where if any of these things are true, right, then an air filtration device is recommended. So where cleaning cannot sufficiently remove soil or particulates, right, and that's on any surface. If you had a concern about soil or particulates because of the regular home maintenance or the regular type of occupancy, whatever it is, it's normal use. When airflow is directed through interstitial spaces, that's a separate statement. Right, so if I'm going to use an inter-air drying system, if I'm going to ventilate the area behind and underneath cabinetry, if I'm going to use a hardwood floor drying system over the surface of a tongue and groove hardwood floor that's got flutes on the bottom, then any use of that air filtrate or that inter-air drying system to evacuate the air from these spaces that are not normally a part of the breathable atmosphere and blow that air up into that space, that's going to be a trigger for that same statement. Or this is a separate one, there are high-risk occupants. So in any of those use cases, it is recommended restorers install one or more air filtration devices. Really important to kind of take a step back again and look at that language. And when an air filtration device is something that you determine is going to be necessary on that project, just tag it to the root reason why it was being used. And again, kind of a great introduction into the digital space where we can provide notes and documentation on that type of specialty equipment use. Clark?
That's exactly right, Brandon. And with the something common that I've seen in my experience is, when we're looking at recommendations for equipment application. So there's a calculation involved in how many air movers I should be installing for a given affected room, or how many pints per day of dehumidification I should be applying to a drying area. It's all rooted in mathematics. And with things like specialty drying equipment, like air filtration devices or air change systems, it's sort of up to your experience with your overall drying strategy. So providing kind of your reasoning behind how you're going to implement a drying strategy, or documenting the reason why you're using air scrubbers is really important. And with the digital documentation platform, you're able to document all of your reasoning behind why you've used your specialty drying equipment, with all your notes, capturing photographs, whether that's a note about the condition of the homeowner, or your drying strategy to direct airflow into wall cavities and things like that. It's giving you a tool to document all of the choices and decisions that you're making in the field, and document them in real time, directly on your device. And with the technology that we have, that can be voice activated. You can just talk to text that note in. You don't have to sit there and typing. You can just go throughout the business of drying the structure without getting bogged down in fat fingering notes and things like that. So it's really powerful to capture all of this information, all the decisions that you're making in the field. You might come back the next day that, why did I do that? I can't remember, when you have your notes. So it's a really powerful tool at your disposal.
And one of the things you said earlier, Clark, that I really held on to as you said it was, it's important to kind of build that narrative, right, to tell that story. And with decisions like that, having, even if it's just a couple of sentences that say, upon initial inspection, noticed, a significant amount of, surface soils on the surfaces where air movement was to be directed, and cleaning processes were not, applicable for these surfaces or whatever it was. And that's all you really need, right? If that's in the file and you've got that note there, and that note comes across with, any third party that's going to be looking at that information, any stakeholder, that goes, a million miles to help support those decisions. So it's just important to capture those kind of thoughts and notes as they occur as we're making those drying decisions. So I noticed a question, by the way, come in the Q&A that I'm gonna hit real quickly here before we move on. And the question was, and thank you, Trudy, the question was, does this standard address negative pressure, or would that be something that we would want to refer to the owner's manuals for? There actually is some reference to when negative air is important in the current 2021 S500. It talks about using negative air and negative air pressure as it relates to substructures like crawl spaces. So if we're going to be moving air through a crawl space, then we want to depressurize that crawl space, at least not positively pressure, so we don't force that air up into living space up above. It also talks a bit about the use of negative air when we're drying interstitial spaces. If we can't validate the cleanliness of those interstitial spaces, then a negative air flow is more appropriate than a positive air flow. So we don't displace any contaminants out into the environment. And through that negative air flow, we can ensure that that air is coming right to that air filtration device. So you have more control under that negative pressure. So there is some discussion there with pressurization as it relates to contaminants specifically. But if all we're doing is just providing air scrubbing for the purpose of air scrubbing in a space just because we're concerned about some dust and dirt and debris, then it's really air filtration, air scrubbing rather, not necessarily pressurization that we're concerned about at that point. And as I'm probably preaching to the choir with most of you on this, but if I'm not ducting the air scrubber in any way, I'm just placing it within the space, then we're scrubbing, right? We're not necessarily using a negative air machine. And either one of those applications would be appropriate depending on the circumstance. So let's kind of jump out of the equipment space now, and let's get into the safety and health conversation a little bit. I got three things I want to touch on here. The first one is going to be just an awareness statement, and that is around respirable silica dust. I'm going to get into category 3 and some initial cleaning. Respirable silica dust is something that really became a topic of awareness in our industry here over the last 5 to 7 years. It just like with asbestos and other things where we had a substance, a material that we knew had very specific known negative health impact, where there was a potential for exposure in construction, remodeling, and other services of the like. Silica dust is one of those things where we've just as a society, we've become more aware that exposure to high levels of silica dust when we're cutting concrete and other materials that contain silica does have some very negative health effects, very negative health ramifications, especially with repeated exposures or high dose exposures. So for that reason, and because it is a really important awareness topic, it's something that was brought into the S500 just to ensure that we create that awareness around it. For those that operate in the United States, OSHA has started to take a much stronger stand around respirable silica dust. Those of you that operate in Canada, I know that you are well ahead of the curve there, and that's something that's been on the radar there for much longer than it has been down here in the United States. And really the call to action that I want to create here for you is just to ensure that you're aware of this, right? The health and safety of our workers and occupants has got to be first and foremost. And if you're not familiar with how to protect from respirable silica dust, especially during demolition processes, then it's something you need to study up on, and you need to make sure it gets into your standard operating procedures so that your technicians, while they're in the field, especially during the demo work, are properly protecting themselves so that they don't have any long-term health effects from exposure. With that, again, just kind of a touch on documentation here within the mobile apps with Clark.
Yeah, and this is a quick one. I just wanted to relate back to, the whole point of what you're doing with a digital platform is telling the story of the loss. So if you encounter any contaminants or health safety risks, you're able to document those, right? And it seemed, kind of sound like a broken record a little bit, but documenting what's going on the job is a part of protecting yourself as well, right? So I think there's kind of a correlation there between, you're protecting your physical person, but you're also and your technicians are protecting themselves, but you're also protecting the kind of your overall job, your performance for documenting how you're drawing the structure and what measures you are taking to protect yourselves and the property owners, so that you have a nice clean project file, right?
Perfect. Thank you, Clark. So next year, I want to get into another very substantive change within the S500 that relates to safety and health, but also relates to a lot of our processes, and that's in and around Category 3 water. So first, let me talk about the words that changed, and then I want to kind of dive in a little bit deeper as to how that change impacts the industry at large. So first, with Category 3 water, there were two words, and they seem like very tiny words, but two words changed in the definition. First of all, you can see them in blue on screen: waistline backflows that originate from beyond any trap. The previous language in the S500 did not contain the word any, and that created some confusion around the definition, that Category 3 water was water that originated from beyond a trap. Well, any trap clarifies that it does not matter what that plumbing system is. If the plumbing system has a trap, a structure that is designed to create basically a water plug to prevent the backflow of gases and other things up into the structure that are unwanted, that can be potentially contaminated and potentially have negative health effects. If that trap was built into that plumbing system, it's there for a reason, right? Therefore, if water comes from beyond that trap up into the structure, it is automatically Category 3, unless tested and determined otherwise. Now, that's an out that is always there, right? If it comes from beyond a trap, and we don't believe that just because that trap was there in that unique circumstance that it actually is significantly contaminated and grossly unsanitary, then we can bring in a third party, right, and have them test and evaluate to determine if it is or not. The second word that changed that's really important and substantive is the word can in another sentence. Category 3 water can carry trace levels of regulated hazardous materials. Previously, that word can was if. All right, if it carries trace levels. And that was actually in my definition, and I don't want to speak for the entire IICRC here, but this is just me speaking to it. I believe the word if in the previous statement was actually a typo, because in reality, Category 3 water does not necessarily have regulated hazardous materials in it. The reason it was there is because part of the Category 3 water discussion was about raising floodwaters and floodwaters coming into a structure, and that those floodwaters could potentially carry regulated hazardous materials in them. Even sewage can bring in regulated hazardous materials. Sometimes institutional or industrial losses have regulated hazardous materials just because of the type of structure that they are. So the call out here is really intended to be a differentiator between Category 3 and what some of us call Category 4, which is not really Category 4, but some of us call it that, right? It's that regulated hazardous materials and mold specialty designation. Just because there are trace levels of regulated hazardous materials does not automatically make it a regulated hazardous materials and mold project, okay? The other note I want to make that is really important, that gets a lot of misinterpretation with Category of water, is that the designation of a category and the designation of regulated hazardous materials and mold are two separate designations. One does not replace the other. Okay, and I'm going to make sure I clarify that, because it's a very common misconception with the S500. If I've determined that we have, for example, asbestos present on a loss, and my ceilings have collapsed to a popcorn ceiling, I haven't determined it, but I'm suspecting it, then we now have asbestos, and we have it tested and verified, and yes, it's hot for asbestos, then that designation does not change my category designation. If it was a clean water source, it's still a Category 1. If it was an unclean source, it's still a Category 2. If it's grossly unsanitary, it's still a Category 3. My restoration procedures are still determined by that category. What changes is whatever required by the appropriately licensed asbestos abatement firm for them to deal with the asbestos. And by the way, they have the trump card, right? So anything that they need to do and are doing is going to take precedence over anything that I need to do and am doing, right? So that doesn't change. There are two exclusive, if you will, designations on the project. And a lot of people assume that as soon as you call it, regulated hazardous materials, and category goes out the door, that's a category 3 automatically. Well, no, it's not. And the reason it's not is because that requires special handling and special procedures by specialty qualified and specially licensed individuals. And they're going to set the protocol and the precedents for what needs to be done. And then we're going to do everything that we can around them, as long as, again, we give them that trump card that their processes take priority. All right, so that's category 3 water. Again, any trap, and category 3 can carry trace levels, but it does not necessarily mean that it automatically is a regulated hazardous materials or mold situation. So with that, again, I'll hand things back over to Clark to talk a little bit about category from the digital space.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brandon. And, one observation I have, it's amazing how much one word can change a statement. So in the, in the standard of care, there's a big difference between if and can. So, part of what a digital platform is giving you, specifically in this case with a platform like Mika, is that the kind of the backup that you need in the field to validate what you're thinking about the loss. So if you're encountering something that says, where did this loss originate, and what is the state of this water, and how much contaminant is potentially in it, and what does that actually mean for me? All of that's available to you. All of the definitions, everything that comes from the S500 is available to you in Mika. So it's almost acting like a digital version of it. It's got specific references to it. It doesn't have the entire document in it necessarily. But it's built from it. And so it's providing you with all of the technical information that you need to make decisions on the go in the field. And when you are making those decisions, you're able to document them. And one of the fun parts of what we do is to stay up to speed with these changes as they take place in the S500. So
perfect. Thank you, Clark.
Yes, sir.
All right, then kind of rounding out the S500 changes, last kind of change here I want to talk about really isn't a change. It's just additional clarity, if you will, or additional emphasis on initial cleaning on category 1. In the previous edition of the S500, cleaning and pre-cleaning a water mitigation project was already a topic. And, in many circumstances, when we respond to a water mitigation project, no home is perfectly sterile, right? No home is perfectly clean. No commercial building is perfectly clean. So in any given mitigation project, a process of pre-cleaning is something that really needs to be considered, because the best time to get a good thorough cleaning on a carpet is when the carpet's already saturated, right? It doesn't really matter how wet your cleaning process is. I mean that only half jokingly. So pre-cleaning is a good step to ensure that the organic material that's necessary for the foul odors that we could get at 1 or 2 or 3 days into the project are greatly mitigated. The amplification of other microbial problems and concerns are greatly mitigated by removing as much of that organic material as we can early in the process. It also reduces the amount of that dust and dirt and debris that can become airborne as we move through the drying process, because initially on day 1, when most of that dust and dirt is wet, you're not going to have a lot of it become airborne because it's wet, it's heavy, right? But as you begin to remove the moisture from things like carpet in particular, and that moisture is leaving that dust and dirt, it becomes much more light, much more of a, easy to become airborne and get suspended in the air and remain in the air for quite some time. So pre-cleaning has been a topic in the S500 for quite some time. In the most recent edition of the S500, it was just further clarified. In section 1.2.4, which if you're not familiar with the S500 is the principal section, that principal section specifically states that restorers should clean and dry water damaged structures, systems, and contents. Doesn't say category 1, 2, or 3, it says should, right up there in the beginning of the process. Section 12.4.5, with initial cleaning on category 1, it states again, prior to implementing restorative drying efforts, restorers should evaluate, then clean materials within the work area as needed, right? So evaluate, and wherever necessary, pre-clean. 12.5.3, controlling airflow, prior to implementing the restorative drying effort, restorers should evaluate, then clean materials within the work area, again, as needed. Right? So several different places here where that is touched on and addressed. So with that, hand it back over to Clark.
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, and with a digital tool, you're able to actually create, I keep harping on this, but this repeatable, repeatable process for when your technicians are in the field, giving them the guidelines for what steps I need to take to return this property to pre-loss condition. As Brandon just pointed out with the changes in the S500, a huge aspect of that is what you do before you even set up your drying equipment. How you go about preparing the property to be dried, because you don't want to start setting up air movers and start blowing around particulate and causing more mayhem and more damage. So having the ability to manage your workflows of what happens from the moment I get onto the job site to the moment we're picking up our equipment and we're leaving and we're getting our certificate of completion signed. So you can create a checklist of things that need to be done on each visit, depending on what type of loss you're dealing with, in order to ensure that the correct restorative procedures have been completed. And when you create these actual workflows that are actionable, you have the kind of the CYA that you need to document what's going on in the field to, again, tell that story of the project narrative, as it were.
Perfect. Thank you, Clark. And as we roll over here to kind of some of the closing thoughts that Clark and I have, before I hand it over to you, Clark, to go through the dashboard here, I just want to remind everybody that we're going to have some Q&A time here at the end. So if you've thought of a question that you haven't put into the Q&A, now's a really good time to start dropping those questions in, because we're going to have a good amount of time for Clark and I to field really any water mitigation related questions that you may have. We'll take our absolute best at it. So it doesn't have to be specifically on the topics that we went through today. If you've got anything you want to talk about as it relates to the water mitigation space, drop it into the Q&A. And if it's something that we just absolutely can't answer, I'll make sure I let you know, but we'll take a stab at just about anything. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Clark again here to talk a little bit about the water mitigation dashboard, something very specific out of our BI tool, and I'll let Clark introduce that. So Clark, your floor, sir.
Thanks, Brandon. Yep. So with our water mitigation dashboard, what you're able to do is kind of measure performance of all of your, whether it's your project managers or other, whatever you want to look at. But all of the data that you collect in our digital platforms allows you to, keep tabs on overall operational performance. So what we're looking at here is just an example with dummy data. So may not represent, accurate, actual real life data, but it's providing an approximation of what you can kind of do with that data, what determinations you can make with that data. So with that said, with our BI tool, you're able to take all of the data that you're collecting in the field and the manner of collection, which is through our digital platform, you're able to make decisions about how you're running your business, right? So if you're measuring the performance of a subset of your project managers or an overall office's performance, you have multiple locations, you're able to really dive into this data and see, where it's coming from as well. So as we look into the overall mitigation duration based on an office, let's say, we can dive in and look at which projects took longer and maybe try to figure out why. So it allows us to kind of recognize trends in our ability to perform our restoration services. So the BI tool provides a really compelling way to analyze the information that you're collecting in the field, and get much deeper into how to become a more efficient and profitable contractor.
And as we roll into look at one of these a little bit closer, however your organization analyzes, its statistics as an organization, and the data that really drives how successful you are as a business. However you kind of slice that and come at it, this is a really important part of, I think, our industry's ability to mature. I think as an industry, we've, historically, we're built on a foundation of people that just don't mind hard work, right? They don't mind, getting up at midnight and trudging around in somebody's crawl space because they've had a sewage backflow, and that's not fun stuff, right? So to be able to excel in an industry like this and being willing and able to drive up the energy to do the work that we do as an industry is hard. It's very, very difficult. so I think as an industry, that's the foundation that we're built on. What we're not necessarily built on is being good businesses, right? And understanding, how do I measure not how wet a 2x4 is? How do I measure how effective I am as an organization and how effective our business is? And what are our goals as a business? What are the key metrics that really drive the health of our organization? So something like this, a tool like this, or a system like this, however you come at it as an organization, is critical to ensure that you're sustainable, right? The next time that we have, a big COVID-19 pandemic or a market crash or whatever it is, you need to ensure the organization has the health and the the ability to springboard through those types of events, as they occur in our industry. And looking at metrics like this is how you do that, right? It's how you ensure that your business is healthy. So, with that, let's go ahead and drive a little bit closer and look at one of these graphs in specific here, Clark, and I'll jump ahead for you.
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, so, just to harken back to what I mentioned previously, this is all coming from a test account. So the numbers probably not entirely accurate or reflective of what we would encounter in the real world. But being able to break this down by your specific manager allows you to project manager allows you to identify what the trend is for their performance, right? So when you have a specific PM who maybe has a trend to have longer drying projects, you can identify and take action and say why. What is the reason? Or if maybe they don't get their certificate of completion signed within a reasonable time, as you drill down and you identify that, oh, this project duration was 4 days, but then the certificate of completion is not signed until several days later, it allows you to make decisions that will benefit your business, right?
Perfect. And then the kind of the background data behind this, Clark?
Yeah, and this is just an example of drilling down into that data that supports what's being visually represented to you in those graphs. So allowing you to actually click into and see, all right, what job is this coming from? And maybe I know the reason why certain complications arose and why it took so long to get the COS signed and things like that, right? So providing you with the ability to control your data, right? Empowering you to make decisions on the data that you're collecting in the field.
Perfect. Thank you, Clark. All right, and with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to roll into some Q&A, and we've got a number of questions that have popped up. A lot of these questions are very, very product specific. So Clark, I'll give you a heads up. I'm going to let you drill into a lot of these that are more kind of Dash and Mika specific as I take the first technical one on here. So I'll give you a chance to kind of digest those. So the first real technical question I see here is, can we justify dust cleaning on day one due to the high airflow in the room, and will it be justified? So a couple ways I want to address this question. First of all, if there is a physical evidence of the fact that you've got a higher than normal amount of dust and debris and particulate in the space, then logic would tell me that most likely, yes, you're going to be able to justify that cleaning on the front side. Because the S500 has specific language to it, right? I hesitate a little bit giving you a 100% yes, just because we all know how some of that conversation may go. But when you can point to specific language in the S500 that says, evaluate then clean as needed, that it's a standard of care, it's a trigger statement within the S500, and you can point specifically to that 1.2.6 saying, here's why I did it, it says it right here in the S500, then I think you're going to have a very, very high level of success helping others understand the reason why you've done what you've done. So my response is yes, do it because the standard says it, justify it with the standard and using the language the standard has to justify it, and ensure you include that in that narrative, right? Clark did a great job of talking about how that project narrative is so important. Just take the 2 seconds that it takes to throw that into the notes and make sure it's there. My philosophy is always try to answer the questions you anticipate before they're asked, right? And that's why that narrative is so important. If I can anticipate the question before somebody asks me the question, then that helps my accounts receivable, right? My cash flow is, I submit at the end of the day the bill for the work that I'm doing, and the more we have to go back and forth, the longer it takes for that check to come in. So if I can support that with my narrative and that information is already there supported with that standard language, I tend to eliminate a lot of that back and forth because the documentation kind of speaks for itself. So to answer the question in a very long format, is it justified? Yeah, use the S500 to justify it, cite the specific section, and do what the S500 says, because the S500 says to do it. So with that said, I'm going to roll over to Clark. Clark, do you have any of the more product-related questions that you want to start off with?
I sure do. Yeah, thanks, Brandon. I'm going to go kind of the opposite way. I'm going to start with the short answer first. So for Claude, thanks for asking this question. Just to reiterate it in case anybody doesn't have the Q&A panel open. So Mika can be used for workflows instead of Dash. Short answer, no. But kind of more complex answer is in a way. I would caution against using it instead of, because you're getting a different experience altogether with Dash. Dash is providing you with workflows, items that kind of flow from one to the next. With Mika, you're getting more of a simplified checklist that's still providing you with a guidance. But the workflow that exists in Mika is very specific to water mitigation. The workflow in Mika is providing you with the steps you take to remediate or mitigate the property. It's not transferable over to, what your workflows should be on this risk or that risk or this rebuild or this demo project, right? It's just Mika is your mitigation industry control application, your water app. Dash is more holistic, covers the entire spectrum of the restoration industry. So Claude, I hope that answers your question.
All right, perfect. And I'll grab one for you from Mike. Mike asked the question, is it safe to say that the majority of demo jobs would justify the use of air filtration devices if there is going to be dust created? I'm always going to give it depends, Mike, just simply because, if the demolition job, and I'll go to the extreme to justify my it depends. If the demolition is on a category 3 water damage that affected rather the entire property, then it kind of depends a little bit on just how far that demo is going to go. But in most cases, yeah, if you're doing demolition work, then to some degree, you need to control the dust and the particulate and the debris that's going to be created from that, if at the very least, just to prevent it from settling in places and then having to be cleaned back up again. So negative pressurization, ventilation, those are all very, very important as well. And in some circumstances, you may be able to get by with the negative pressure and ventilation alone, depending on the circumstances. But in most cases, you've got to ventilate the air or filtrate rather the air that you're ventilating, depending on where it's going. And usually air scrubbing in the process, in addition to that ventilation, can be beneficial too, depending on the circumstance. So my kind of short answer on that, Mike, is going to be, yeah, generally yes. Are there exceptions to every rule? Yes, but generally yes. So great question, Mike. And with that, I'll pass it over to Clark. Clark got another one he wants to jump onto.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Brandon. So Larry asked a really good question. Is Mika a part or addition to Dash? Do they work together or just different pathways for documentation? It's a great question. Mika is a separate application from Dash. We are working on kind of providing pathways for these applications to communicate more directly with each other. There are several really great ways that they do communicate. You can link jobs between the two platforms. Mika is your field application for water mitigation. So what you can send back to Dash includes things like notes, photos, certain dates, and forms. So all that key data. There are some enhancements that we are working on to allow that communication between the two platforms to be a little bit more seamless, but they are connected, but they are separate applications.
All right, perfect. And I did notice a couple, just the last questions here that we'll take last before we sign off with everybody. And I'll take this one. Why would we use Mika over Dash? Mika is a more robust water mitigation application. The detail available inside of Mika for Water Mit is pretty extensive for those that have not had a chance to use it. And if you hadn't had a chance to see it, let us know. We'd be more than happy to show some of those details under the hood. But it is a more robust water mitigation application. Whereas, Dash, as you had said, Clark, it covers the full gamut. But if you're specializing in water mitigation and need the detailed documentation specific in Water Mit in the field, that field side of that documentation, Mika is going to be a bit more robust in that category. So, and then the last one here, Clark, I'm not sure if you may understand this question. When will the checklist program be ready? Do you understand where that question is coming from?
I am not sure.
All right. So what I would ask,
maybe pertaining to a specific project.
Got it.
I'm not sure.
All right, so with that, then, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very, very much for your time. Again, this was the kickoff session for Connect Pulse. There are many, many more tracks and sessions that are ongoing throughout the week. If you have not taken the opportunity to register for some of these additional sessions, you're going to find a lot of really good, powerful business and technical content in every one of these sessions. So please register for additional sessions. We thank you so much for spending the time and hope you have a wonderful week.